Have you ever had a conversation with someone about something they deeply believe in, maybe about faith, politics, or a really important personal choice, and part of you was, well, hoping they might eventually see things differently?
Oh, definitely. That happens all the time.
Right. Now imagine that conversation unfolds, and you hear their reasoning, their justification, and it sounds internally consistent, maybe even pretty reasonable from their perspective.
Yeah, you can follow their logic even if you don't agree with the starting point.
Exactly. But despite acknowledging that, you still feel this quiet nudge, this pull, this impulse to somehow persuade them to change their mind anyway. What is going on in your head in that moment? What psychological forces are at play, even when you're trying your best to be rational and respectful on the surface?
Those are such relatable scenarios, and they tap into a fascinating intersection of psychology and communication, that internal dynamic you just described. That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Absolutely. Today we're getting into a single, incredibly insightful source, a paper titled Activist Impulses in Street Epistemology, a Psychological Analysis.
And this paper takes that very specific, sometimes subtle moment, the one you just painted so well, and puts it under the microscope. It's not trying to judge street epistemology overall, good or bad.
Right, it's not about taking sides on SE itself.
No, exactly. Instead, it zeroes in on the internal psychological landscape of a street epistemologist who, while following the outward form of respectful, open inquiry, is also inwardly driven by a goal to change the other person's belief.
It's focusing on that tension point, when persuasive goals bump up against the stated ideals of neutral, open inquiry.
That's it, precisely. And it gives us a toolkit for understanding this by looking at it through 4 powerful psychological lenses: moral psychology, cognitive dissonance, social psychology, and communication theory. It offers a really nuanced map of what might be happening beneath the surface during these conversations.
Okay, let's start by making sure we're all on the same page. What is street epistemology at its core? And where does this idea of an activist impulse even enter the picture, according to this source?
Okay, so at its heart, street epistemology, or SE, is described as a conversational technique. It's focused on collaboratively examining the reasons people have for their beliefs.
Collaboratively examining reasons. Got it.
Yeah, and the ideal is built on principles like epistemic humility, sort of acknowledging you don't know everything, and mutual inquiry, where both people are exploring together. It typically uses open-ended Socratic questioning.
Socratic questions, okay.
Not to debate whether the belief is true, but to explore how the person arrived at and maintains that belief.
So it's about the foundation of the belief, the why and how, rather than just the what's.
Precisely. Now, the source talks about an activist-style approach within SE. This is where the subtle shift happens. Outwardly, it still looks like neutral inquiry, asking questions, listening carefully.
Seems fine on the surface.
Right. But the paper argues that inwardly, there's an underlying, maybe even unconscious strategic goal: to persuade the other person, to change their belief, while still presenting the appearance of respecting their reasoning process.
And I remember the paper mentioning that one of the roots of this activist framing goes right back to the founder.
That's right. Peter Boghossian, in his book A Manual for Creating Atheists, actually framed SE as a tool for activists, specifically mentioning atheists, skeptics, humanists, philosophers, to help people overcome faith.
So the activist idea was kind of baked in from early on.
Well, this source suggests that an activist ethos was arguably part of the concept from its inception, at least in that framing. So the paper isn't inventing this activist angle. It's analyzing the psychology of a street epistemologist when persuasion is the underlying driver. It's especially when they encounter reasoning that seems sound but, well, doesn't lead where they expect.
That makes sense. So let's get into the first lens. How does moral psychology shed light on this drive to persuade, even in the face of seemingly sound reasoning?
This is where it starts to get really interesting. Moral psychology tells us that when we hold a belief with strong moral conviction, it doesn't just feel like a personal opinion.
Right, it feels bigger than that.
Yeah, it feels like it's tied to absolute right or wrong, objectively true, and universally applicable.
Like, this isn't just what I think. This is fundamentally true or good or right in the world.
Exactly. And the source cites research showing this kind of moral conviction creates a powerful imperative to evangelize or correct those who disagree. The stronger your moral conviction, the paper notes, the greater your intolerance of dissenting views.
Makes sense.
And the more likely you are to engage in activism or efforts to sway others.
Okay, so applying that to a street epistemologist, If they see a belief, say, one they perceive as leading to harm, or one they see as fundamentally untrue and therefore damaging as morally wrong.
But their moral conviction about the wrongness or potential harm of that belief can create a strong determination to intervene, even if they genuinely feel the other person's process of arriving at the belief is internally logical.
Within their own framework.
Right. Based on seemingly sound reasons within their framework, the street epistemologist might feel a moral urgency to challenge the belief itself because they see it leading to bad outcomes in the world.
So the perceived consequence of the belief becomes a strong motivator, perhaps even overriding the respect for the person's reasoning process in that moment.
That's a key point the paper makes. This taps into consequentialist reasoning, the idea that persuading someone away from a harmful belief will lead to better results. The ends justify the means thinking can, according to the paper's analysis, subtly broaden ethical boundaries in the street epistemologist's mind.
How so?
Well, it makes them feel justified in pushing harder, maybe using more directive questions, because the desired outcome, getting rid of the bad belief, feels morally crucial.
The source mentioned research on moral advocacy in relation to this. What did that find?
Yes, that research found that framing an issue around core moral values like harm, fairness, things like that, significantly increases the urge to proselytize, to convert others. Messages with moral weight tend to make advocates more polarized and more determined to push their viewpoint. So, a street epistemologist who believes holding unfounded beliefs is morally wrong, or perhaps leads to injustice, might unconsciously infuse that moral judgment into the conversation.
Creating a sense of duty, almost.
Yeah, a feeling of heightened duty to dismantle the belief, even if the interlocutor seems like a perfectly rational person who arrived at it reasonably for them.
It sounds like from their perspective, they might genuinely feel they are helping, like it's for the other person's good.
The paper describes this as paternalistic altruism, a sincere belief that they are doing what's best for the other person, genuinely trying to save them from a harmful or false belief. But this moralized impulse carries a potential risk, according to the source's analysis.
And that risk is?
Seeing oneself as a righteous agent of truth. This can, the paper suggests, lead to what the psychologist Albert Bandura called moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement. What's that?
It's basically reframing questionable tactics or subtle manipulations as acceptable because they serve a higher purpose. An activist street epistemologist might, for a moment, justify using leading questions or selectively highlighting weaknesses in the other's position by telling themselves, it's for their own good, I'm guiding them to the truth.
So it's like they mentally bypass the potential ethical gray area by focusing on the nobility of their perceived goal.
Exactly. The paper argues this allows them to momentarily quiet any scruples they might have about fully respecting the other person's autonomy, convincing themselves that their persuasive push is actually a virtuous act. It references research warning that even genuinely caring people can sometimes behave in ways that feel cold or detached when they believe they are serving a noble cause.
Treating the other person more like an object.
Yeah, like an object that needs to be corrected or fixed, rather than an equal dialogue partner.
Wow. So this moral psychology perspective highlights this powerful internal tension. The ethical ideals of street epistemology, like honesty and respecting reason, can clash with the sometimes blinding force of moralized motivations and the perceived urgency to change beliefs seen as harmful. It really sets up an internal stage for conflict.
It does. And that internal conflict brings us directly to the next lens the paper uses: cognitive dissonance.
Ah, Festinger's theory. That uncomfortable feeling when you hold conflicting thoughts or beliefs. How does that play out for an activist street epistemologist, according to the source?
Well, the paper identifies a couple of key inconsistencies that create this discomfort, this dissonance. First, there's the clash between the street epistemologist's self-image and their actions.
How they see themselves versus what they're doing.
Right. They likely see themselves and present themselves as a neutral facilitator, valuing epistemic humility and open exploration. But if they have that underlying goal to persuade, their actions are subtly steering towards a predetermined outcome. That gap between who they think they are and what they're actually doing creates tension.
Okay, so there's stated principles versus their hidden goal. Makes sense. What's the other source of dissonance?
The second major source comes from their expectations about rationality. A street epistemologist likely operates with the assumption, maybe implicitly, that if someone genuinely engages in sound, rational epistemological reflection,
they'll end up agreeing with the street epistemologist's view.
Essentially, yes. That they'll arrive at the conclusion that beliefs without strong evidence are unwarranted, basically, the street epistemologist's own skeptical viewpoint. But what happens when they encounter someone who seems to be reasoning soundly, who can articulate their justification clearly, and still holds the target belief?
That would really challenge their worldview, wouldn't it?
Mm.
It undermines the implicit idea that their own position is the inevitable logical endpoint of pure rationality.
It's very jarring psychologically. And that uncomfortable psychological tension, the dissonance needs to be reduced. People don't like feeling inconsistent.
So how does the paper suggest a street epistemologist might try to reduce that feeling?
Well, the classic ways people reduce dissonance apply. One primary strategy is self-justification. They find ways to convince themselves that they are, in fact, still upholding street epistemology ideals, even while pursuing a persuasive agenda.
Like telling themselves a different story about what they're doing.
Kind of. They might think, I'm not really trying to persuade, I'm just helping them think more deeply. Or they will genuinely be better off if they let go of this belief, so my steering is a form of help. They are adding these consonant cognitions thoughts that align, like I'm helping them reach clarity, to reduce the psychological cost of acting against their stated principle of neutrality.
So they're reducing their guilt or sense of hypocrisy without actually changing their behavior. They just reframe it.
Precisely. It allows them to maintain a positive self-image while still pushing their agenda. Another strategy the paper points to is altering their perception of the interlocutor.
How does that work?
Initially, they might acknowledge, okay, their reasoning seems pretty coherent within their framework. But if the person remains unconvinced and doesn't shift towards the street epistemologist's view, the street epistemologist might unconsciously start looking for, or even subtly manufacturing, subtle flaws in their logic, or assuming there's some underlying hidden irrationality or emotional attachment driving the belief.
Okay. So if the reasoning wasn't truly sound after all, that resolved the inconsistency between sound reasoning leads to my view, and this person with seemingly sound reasoning disagrees. It makes the other person the problem, not the street epistemologist's assumption.
It totally resolves it, at least internally, and justifies continuing to apply pressure. The paper draws a really interesting parallel here to Festinger's classic study of the failed prophecy cult. Remember that?
Vaguely, yeah. The world didn't end when they thought it would.
Right. Massive disconfirming evidence. But many highly committed members didn't abandon their belief. Instead, they doubled down on proselytizing, trying to gain new converts.
Why? Because having new converts served as consonant supporters that validated their original, now contradicted belief, made them feel less wrong.
Exactly. The activist street epistemologist, according to this analysis, faces a similar moment. When confronted with someone who doesn't follow the expected path of rational reflection leading to doubt about their belief, the street epistemologist may increase their efforts to change the person's mind to resolve that uncomfortable internal conflict.
So success becomes proof.
See, rationality does lead to the truth.
Yeah.
Even the strenuous attempt reinforces their belief in the rational superiority of their own position.
And the source mentions that the more effort you invest in trying to persuade someone, the more committed you become to the idea that your cause is right.
Right. It's a self-reinforcing loop. When you commit an action that might feel slightly inconsistent with your values, like pushing an agenda when you claim neutrality, you often justify it by elevating the importance of the goal. The street epistemologist might think, okay, maybe I wasn't perfectly neutral, but it was absolutely necessary because getting rid of this harmful belief is that important.
The more they push, the more they believe in the rightness of pushing.
Exactly. Partly to avoid seeing themselves as inconsistent or unethical. It's a powerful illustration of how our minds work to keep our self-image intact, sometimes at the cost of objective perception or adherence to our own principles.
So cognitive dissonance theory helps us understand the internal psychological maneuvers, the self-justifications, the shifting perceptions of the other person that allow an activist street epistemologist to feel like they're still being fair and rational, even as their actions are subtly steering the conversation towards a desired conclusion.
And the paper suggests this process can risk blinding them to the fact that they've perhaps departed from the pure ideal of epistemic humility and genuine mutual inquiry. It becomes harder to see their own deviation.
That makes a lot of sense.
Click subscribe. It's cheaper than hay and twice as fun.
Am I signing up for a channel, or am I trying to impress a herd of cows?
Yeah.
Okay, let's switch gears to the third lens mentioned in the source, social psychology, and how our everyday biases might play a role here.
Right. A fundamental concept from social psychology that's highly relevant here is the bias blind spot. It's fascinating.
Bias blind spot, what's that exactly?
Basically, we're remarkably good at spotting biases in other people's thinking and behavior, but we're often terrible at recognizing our own biases. We think we're objective.
So a street epistemologist might easily see how someone else's belief is influenced by their upbringing, emotions, community pressure.
Totally, like, oh, they're just emotionally attached, or they believe that because everyone around them does. But simultaneously, they might view their own skeptical stance as purely the result of objective reason and evidence. The paper touches on research indicating people have this unwarranted faith in their own impartiality.
Seeing their own judgments as just reality.
Exactly. They see their own view as a direct reflection of reality, while assuming others who see things differently are somehow misled by bias or flawed thinking.
That sounds a lot like naive realism, that basic assumption that I see the world exactly as it is, and if you see it differently, there must be something wrong with you or your reasoning.
It fits perfectly. An activist street epistemologist operating with this bias unconsciously assumes that any conclusion different from their own, even if the interlocutor seems to reason well, must stem from some kind of error or hidden irrationality on the other person's part.
Which makes it easy to justify pushing them.
Right. It makes it easy to justify pushing for change without ever doubting their own impartiality or the validity of their own belief framework. They aren't being biased or pushy in their own mind. They are simply trying to help someone who is clearly not seeing things straight.
The irony, as you pointed out earlier, is that that very conviction of their own objectivity can be a form of bias itself.
Absolutely. Another layer here, according to the paper, is social identity theory.
Okay, how does group identity fit in?
Street epistemologists often identify strongly with communities skeptical, atheist, humanist, rationalist groups, whatever it might be. We derive part of our self-esteem from belonging to these groups and tend to favor the views and values of our in-group.
So the street epistemologist identifies with the rationalist in-group perhaps, and the conversation partner holding the belief being examined is potentially seen as an out-group member, like a religious believer maybe?
That dynamic can subtly bias perception. The in-group's beliefs are seen positively, as products of rigorous thought, while the out-group's beliefs might be viewed with suspicion or as products of flawed processes.
And this in-group favoritism can fuel the activist impulse.
Yeah, the paper suggests it can create a desire to bring the other person into the in-group worldview, which validates the group's position and the street epistemologist's identity within it. A successful conversion can feel like a win for their side, the side of perceived reason and truth.
And then there's the social pressure from the wider activist community itself if they're part of one.
Yeah.
Posting videos, sharing stories.
Yes, the paper suggests that if SE is practiced within a movement focused on tangible results, there can be unspoken pressure or expectation from peers to achieve success stories or videos of people changing their minds. This can foster a performance mindset in the street epistemologist.
Shifting the focus.
Yeah, where the focus subtly shifts from genuine open dialogue to achieving a desired outcome for the benefit of the audience or the group identity. Less about understanding, more about demonstrating effectiveness.
What about other common cognitive shortcuts or biases we all use? Does the source mention those?
Oh, yes. Motivated reasoning is a big one here. The unconscious tendency to process information and evaluate evidence in a way that supports a desired conclusion or goal.
How does that apply?
If the street epistemologist's goal is belief change, this biases how they interpret the conversation. They might unconsciously give more weight to any signs of the interlocutor's uncertainty or perceived weaknesses in their arguments, while downplaying or overlooking any strong justifications or coherent reasons the interlocutor offers.
So the goal literally biases their perception of the reasons being offered, like wearing tinted glasses.
Personal goals bias beliefs, as the saying goes in this area. They might, for example, unconsciously set a much higher evidential bar for the belief they want to change compared to the standard they accept for reasons to doubt that belief. It's an asymmetry.
Classic confirmation bias, really.
Exactly, operating below the surface. Overconfidence is also linked. A belief in one's own superior rationality, perhaps cultivated by self-selection into skeptical communities or reinforced by the group, ties back into naive realism. It grants the street epistemologist implicit permission to fully trust their own perspective and automatically suspect the validity of the other person's.
And finally, I guess the need for closure could play a role too, right? Just wanting an answer.
Absolutely. Many people have a preference for clear, unambiguous answers and feel uncomfortable with unresolved uncertainty. An activist street epistemologist might feel a strong internal drive to achieve a definite outcome, the person changing their mind, because ending a conversation with, okay, we clearly see things differently and both have reasons for our views, might feel like a failure or leave an unsatisfying sense of ambiguity. Pushing for closure resolves that discomfort for them.
So this blend of social pressures and inherent cognitive biases like the bias blind spot, naive realism, motivated reasoning, overconfidence, and need for closure can subtly create an unequal dynamic where the street epistemologist genuinely sees themselves as the rational guide or educator, and the other person as the one who needs assistance to see things correctly.
And crucially, because many of these biases are unconscious, the street epistemologist can sincerely believe they are being completely fair and objective while still operating with a significant unseen tilt towards persuasion. It's quite insidious.
That leads us naturally into the fourth lens the paper discusses: communication theory, and what this dynamic means for the ethical nature of the conversation itself.
Right. Communication theory provides some really valuable frameworks here. Think about Jürgen Habermas's distinction between communicative action and strategic action.
Okay, what's the difference?
Communicative action is aimed at achieving mutual understanding through open dialogue. Think collaboration. Strategic action, on the other hand, is goal-oriented. It uses communication as a tool to influence others to achieve a predefined outcome. Think persuasion or manipulation.
Street epistemology, on the surface, with its questions and listening, looks like communicative action.
It does. But the paper argues that when an activist street epistemologist has that hidden goal of changing the belief, the communication subtly shifts function. It might still look like open inquiry, but it's now operating as strategic action.
The language becomes a tool.
Yeah, the language and questions are used instrumentally as tools to move the other person towards the street epistemologist's preferred conclusion. The aim shifts from genuinely discovering truth together to unilaterally guiding the other person towards what the street epistemologist believes is the truth.
And this is where ethical questions about manipulation and transparency come in, isn't it? If the goal isn't shared.
Exactly. Martin Buber's philosophical distinction between I-thou and I-it relationships is really relevant here.
I-thou versus I-it.
In an I-thou relationship, you see the other person as a full subject, valuing their perspective and engaging with them authentically without a hidden agenda. An I-it relationship treats the other person as an object, something to be used or changed for your own purposes.
So the paper suggests the activist street epistemologist might slip into treating the other person as an it.
That's the concern raised. If the street epistemologist, consciously or unconsciously, treats the interlocutor primarily as an it, an object to be acted upon to achieve the goal of belief, change the dynamic slides away from genuine dialogue towards something more instrumental.
So even if the questions are polite, the underlying stance is instrumental, not truly dialogical.
That's the core of the argument. Buber argued that true dialogue requires a certain level of openness and honesty. If one party withholds their true persuasive agenda, it can feel like a covert form of manipulation. While an activist street epistemologist isn't usually outright lying.
No, they're asking questions.
Right, but the paper's analysis suggests that failing to be fully transparent about the underlying goal of persuasion compromises the honesty and mutuality that ethical dialogue ideally requires. The interlocutor thinks they are in an open-ended exploration, unaware that, from the street epistemologist's perspective, the target belief has already been effectively judged as unwarranted and needs fixing.
This ties into the ethical principle of respecting autonomy, treating others as ends in themselves, not just as means to achieve our goals.
It does. An activist street epistemologist might argue they are respecting autonomy because they are using questions and the person is free to not change their mind. They're not forcing anyone.
Right.
But the counterargument, according to this analysis, is that entering the conversation with a fixed preferred outcome and a hidden unilateral script potentially doesn't fully respect the person's agency to arrive at their own conclusion, whatever that conclusion might be, without being subtly steered.
It sounds like what communication theory calls two-way asymmetrical communication. There's an appearance of exchange, but one side is primarily trying to adjust the other, without being equally open to being adjusted themselves.
Which, again, contrasts with the core values often articulated in street epistemology, like epistemic humility and mutual inquiry. Those values align more with two-way symmetrical communication, where both parties are genuinely open to being influenced and the outcome isn't predetermined.
And the asymmetry the paper identifies in activist SEers.
That the street epistemologist's own belief system is usually not on the table for fundamental change in the same way the interlocutor's is. Their core skepticism, for instance, is typically off-limits. This suggests a potential lack of true epistemic humility, even if performative humility, using phrases like, I could be wrong, or acknowledging limits is present.
The unspoken message, the metacommunication, changes depending on the underlying goal.
Yes. In a purely exploratory SE conversation, the unspoken message is something like, we are jointly investigating how we form beliefs. In an activist SE conversation with a hidden agenda, the paper suggests the unspoken message is closer to, I am guiding you to see why your specific belief is not well-founded.
And that hidden agenda could backfire.
Potentially, yeah. The paper mentions reactance theory. If the interlocutor senses this hidden agenda, even unconsciously, it can trigger psychological reactance, a defensive backlash and resistance, which might make the activist approach counterproductive from a practical communication standpoint anyway, undermines trust.
What if you could challenge what you believe and come out stronger? Start now at navigatingbeliefs.com. Now, is persuasion always unethical? The source does bring up a counter-argument to some of these points, doesn't it? It's not black and white.
It does, and it's important to consider. The paper acknowledges that persuasion isn't inherently unethical. If a street epistemologist sincerely believes that changing a belief is genuinely in the interlocutor's best interest, maybe like persuading someone to quit smoking or wear a seatbelt, it could be framed as ethical advocacy.
Like trying to help someone avoid harm.
Right. The source references Wayne Booth's work, which suggests that persuasion can be ethical and even promote mutual inquiry if it still involves valuing the other person's reasoning and freedom. An activist street epistemologist might see themselves as guiding someone towards a more rational way of thinking, which they believe is a beneficial path for the person.
The tension, though, seems to be that genuine mutual inquiry requires being open to any outcome that arises from the shared exploration, whereas persuasion inherently privileges one specific outcome. That seems like the core conflict.
Exactly. The activist approach, by having that predetermined goal, inevitably skews the dialogue away from pure mutual inquiry, even if subtly. Communication theory helps highlight this tension between the Socratic form of using questions and the rhetorical or influence-focused function when there's a persuasive agenda.
Raising those ethical questions about authenticity.
Yeah. Is the street epistemologist truly open to being taught something new, which is implied by deep humility? Or are they primarily positioning themselves as the teacher guiding a student towards a predefined correct answer? The ethical evaluation ultimately hinges on how you view that dynamic. Is it benevolent guidance or subtle manipulation? There's room for interpretation.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the psychology at play here. So if we pull together the threads from moral psychology, cognitive dissonance, social psychology, and communication theory, what's the overall picture of this activist-style street epistemology presented in the source? Does it fundamentally undermine epistemic humility and mutual inquiry?
Well, the paper's conclusion is quite nuanced, suggesting it significantly risks undermining them. It definitely acknowledges the often sincere motivations of activist street epistemologists.
They mean well, often.
Right. They are often driven by a strong moral conviction that reducing falsehood or irrationality is a good thing, a deep commitment to the value of rationality itself, a genuine desire to help others, and they are often supported and reinforced by their community.
Those are powerful, positive forces. You can understand the drive.
Absolutely. But the analysis shows that these intentions, when combined with powerful, often unconscious psychological forces, can lead to problematic outcomes regarding the very principles SE aims to uphold. Moral zeal, unchecked, can reduce tolerance for differing views. Cognitive biases like the bias blind spot and naive realism make it easy to assume one's own objectivity and the other's error, justifying persuasive tactics.
And the social pressures.
Social pressures can shift the focus to performance and results. And the communication itself, as we just discussed, can become strategic influence rather than genuine mutual exploration.
So the core question, does the activist impulse compromise the core principles? What's the verdict from the source?
The paper suggests it can, and risks doing so significantly. From a strict interpretation of SE ideals, it seems to compromise them. Epistemic humility involves a deep openness to the possibility that you could be wrong and need to revise your own beliefs.
Which isn't usually happening if you're targeting someone else's beliefs.
Exactly. The act of specifically targeting someone else's belief for change, especially when their reasoning seems sound to you initially, implies a level of confidence in your own framework that might contradict that deep humility. Humility can become more of a performance, a tactic, than a genuine internal stance.
And mutual inquiry is definitely challenged if the outcome is already implicitly decided by one party.
Precisely. Inquiry is truly mutual only as long as both parties are genuinely open to various outcomes arising from the exploration. If the street epistemologist has a predetermined outcome and continues to push, however gently, until the interlocutor moves towards it, the mutuality is compromised.
But there are counterpoints, right? It's not totally one-sided.
No, and the source acknowledges them. Street epistemologists can argue they are simply facilitating a process of critical reflection. If a belief is truly sound, it should withstand scrutiny. And the method itself, using questions rather than declarations, does impose a form of humility, forcing the street epistemologist to listen and respond to the other person's perspective.
And compared to debate.
Right. Critically, activist SE is still often far more dialogical and respectful than outright debate or hostile confrontation. It's usually not an attack.
So it's perhaps not a complete abandonment of the principles, but a subtle leaning away from the ideal, a compromise on a spectrum.
Yes, the paper presents it as being on a spectrum. It might not devolve into outright hostility, but it risks tilting the playing field away from the perfectly level exchange that pure inquiry demands. The overall analysis serves as a powerful cautionary tale. Even with the best intentions and a commitment to rationality, unconscious psychological biases and motivations can lead street epistemologists to subtly undermine the very principles that make their method potentially constructive.
That's a crucial point. Given these risks, how can someone who practices street epistemology, or really anyone engaging in similar sensitive conversations about beliefs, try to mitigate this impulse? What does the source suggest?
Awareness is absolutely key, as the paper suggests. Recognizing the potential pull of moral fervor and the presence of these cognitive biases is the first step. Just knowing this stuff exists helps.
Being mindful?
Yes. Actively striving to approach the conversation and, importantly, see the conversation as a genuine exploration rather than a win-lose situation focused on conversion. Prioritizing curiosity about why someone believes something over the goal of changing what they believe.
Focusing on understanding first.
Exactly. The paper also suggests that transparency can help, perhaps even stating explicitly to the interlocutor and reminding oneself that the primary goal is simply to understand the foundations of their belief, not necessarily to change it. This kind of intentional self-awareness and transparency can help keep the conversation closer to the ideal of mutual inquiry.
So the psychological landscape is complex, a mix of genuine conviction, perhaps a desire to help, interwoven with biases and motivations that subtly push towards persuasion, and where emotional investment can sometimes blur the lines of ethical communication. It really highlights both the power of engaging deeply on beliefs using reasoned methods and the potential pitfalls of using those methods with a predetermined, perhaps unspoken, agenda.
Exactly. Whether it fundamentally undermines the core values is debatable and likely exists on a spectrum. From a strict viewpoint, yes, it compromises humility by implicitly positioning the street epistemologist as knowing better, and dilutes mutual inquiry by having a covert goal. But from a more pragmatic perspective, the activist impulse is perhaps an inevitable human element that can hopefully be managed through self-awareness and a conscious commitment to the ideals of genuine dialogue. It really underscores that fine, sometimes challenging line between ethical persuasion and true, open dialogue.
As we wrap up this deep dive, here's a thought to carry with you, something to chew on. Think for a moment about a time you were deeply invested in trying to convince someone else about something you felt was really important or true. How much of your approach in that moment was truly about genuinely exploring the ideas together, being open to the possibility that their perspective might even shift your understanding? And how much of it, if you're being really honest with yourself, was actually driven by a strong desire for them to eventually see things your way? What psychological factors, maybe some of the ones we discussed today, like a sense of moral rightness, that feeling that your view is just obvious reality, or even just the discomfort of unresolved disagreement might have been quietly at play in your own mind during that interaction? It seems this kind of critical self-reflection isn't just a challenge for those who practice street epistemology. It's perhaps a universal challenge for anyone trying to navigate differences in deeply held beliefs in a complex world.